are ways and means of really saving the planet. But at the moment, we have a lot of people out there who don't understand what we're talking about. Unfortunately, they don't have the background. So they have this gut feeling that we have to stop all these dangerous individuals, from mad scientists. I've been called a mad scientist, and a geoengineer, which is the worst insult you can imagine. And this comes only from lack of knowledge. The oxygen minimum zone is a layer below the mixed layer at the top, which is mixed all the time and which is also replenished, where the oxygen is replenished. And the layer below that is the layer where you still get organic matter sinking out, but it's not mixed back up again. And therefore, you have a minimum, an oxygen minimum layer there. And this oxygen minimum zone is not good for the climate, because under oxygen minimum conditions, you start forming methane and nitrous oxide, a laughing gas. This is N2O. And these are very powerful greenhouse gases. There are areas in the ocean where you have, like in the Arabian Sea, you have formation of methane and N2O. But still, the measurements show that once that water containing methane and N2O is mixed with surface water, which happens when that water is upwelled, the bacteria, there are lots of bacteria, specific bacteria that utilize methane when there's oxygen available. So most of that methane is again broken down. And then N2O is also taken up, right? So that doesn't enter the atmosphere. The major sources of N2O and methane are on land. There's swamps and moors and things like that on land, right? But not the ocean. And then in the Southern Ocean, in any case, is an upwelling ocean where you have water coming up. So that water in the oxygen minimum zone is restored continuously. In contrast to the Arabian Sea, now the Arabian Sea is between Arabia and India, right? And it's like a corner. It's the end of a loop going north and then coming south again. So there you can have this accumulation of oxygen poor water in large amounts, or the Gulf of Mexico. These are dead ends. But the Southern Ocean, as you know from the diagrams, it's open, and there's a huge amount of water mixing going on all around it. To my mind, the extent of oxygen limitation in the water column is always going to be low. It's not going to be a critical problem. And it has been raised by people who are trying to denigrate iron fertilization, who've been trying to prevent it from happening for whatever reasons. But I don't see it as a threat.
Many of our listeners and scientists are concerned about eutrophication. And eutrophication is typically understood around rivers. And often if a river flows into an ocean, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, there is a lot of phytoplankton productivity, and a lot of those phytoplankton decompose and then consume oxygen. So typically what people are concerned about is, and this is a question I get a lot, when I ask around what should I ask Victor Smetacek, everyone's concerned about oxygen consumption by decomposing phytoplankton. Typically what happens, they decompose and they may produce oxygen initially by photosynthesis, but then once they decompose, they consume oxygen, and then this leads to oxygen depletion and low oxygen zones in areas like the Gulf of Mexico. So I would love to understand, why would this not happen in the Southern Ocean? You already explained a little bit, but what's the difference between areas like the Southern Ocean and maybe the Gulf of Mexico, or maybe the Bay of Bengal, where you have the same phenomenon, or we also had it in the Black Sea, and we also had it in the Baltic Sea, these low oxygen zones due to phytoplankton bloom. So what's the difference between these areas?
Oh, there are huge differences. It depends. You mentioned the Baltic and the Black Sea. Now, these are inland seas that only have a narrow entrance connecting the sea, the ocean, with this. They were lakes in the past, right? With this fresh water which is entering them, right? So there's big rivers flowing into the Black Sea. So the surface layer of the Black Sea has a very low salinity. And down at depth, the salinity is much higher. And the Black Sea is like 2,000 meters and more deep. The Baltic is a few hundred meters deep. But there you also have the same situation. So North Sea water entering the Baltic, or Mediterranean water entering the Black Sea, it all goes down. And there it stagnates. And there you build up this oxygen minimum because that water is not being replenished. The Baltic more because it's shallower and in the Black Sea less. So the water below 500 meters or even below 200 meters in the Black Sea is permanently anoxic. Right? So there you have that problem. This doesn't apply to the open ocean. So forget that. That's not an example. And if you go to the open ocean, you mentioned the other one was the Gulf of Mexico. There, at the mouth of the Mississippi, you have this oxygen minimum layer at depth. And that's, again, this is the particles that are sinking out, but these are not diatoms. They have not sunk down to the seafloor. They have settled, they've been broken up in intermediate layers, and there that oxygen is also being used up, right? So you have that. Now, the other thing that we don't have on our radar here are the animals. Now, animals also mix ocean water. The whales have definitely been mixing the water. When they're chasing krill, they have to swim very forcefully at the krill so that they don't escape, right? So that's why they have so much muscles. If the muscle is to catch krill, which itself is a very slow swimmer compared to the whale, but they want to get as much krill as possible. What they do is they attack the krill and then they use their tail to propel themselves forward and to get as big a mouthful of krill as possible. But behind them, they have done a huge amount of turbulent energy, mixing energy. So they're mixing the water while they're doing all this, right? While they're feeding, they're mixing the water at the same time. And this used to happen most probably in the Gulf of Mexico also. There used to be big swarms of menhaden, which is a herring-like fish, feeding there. And their numbers have been reduced because it's heavily fished. So perhaps they were also mixing this anoxic zone there. Anyway, so the other thing is that in the perception of many people, the oxygen cycle is not understood. They don't, and this actually shows how the depth of ignorance of even people like scientists working on this problem, who make the claim that every second breath comes from the ocean. I don't know whether you've heard about that.
I've done the claim myself. I'm guilty myself because I heard it somewhere. And it's like a nice fact you like to brag about.
It's rubbish. It's complete rubbish. It has nothing to do. It's a very big misconception. And it has to do with the fact that the ocean actually does produce about twice as much, about the same amount of carbon as on land. Right? The total production on the planet is 100 gigatons of carbon per year for the entire planet. And 60 of that gigatons are on land as estimates, right? And 40 in the ocean. And on land, those plants that are doing photosynthesis, they also release oxygen into the atmosphere. So that's true, right? But in the ocean, the oxygen that is released when carbon is produced, it stays in the ocean. It doesn't come out of the ocean. That's what these people don't understand who use that. And it drives me crazy because it's so wrong, right? That the fact that anybody uses it shows that they don't understand how the ocean functions. So the oxygen produced in the ocean stays in the ocean. As a matter of fact, the oxygen produced in the ocean is getting less and less compared to water exchange, the exchange with the atmosphere. So what is being mixed up over here? Firstly, primary production releases oxygen, but it doesn't mean that oxygen is released to the atmosphere. And that applies also to carbon dioxide, right? So when carbon dioxide is taken up in a given water mass, then that carbon dioxide goes down there, and you build up a deficit. So that water has to mix with surface water, which is in interaction with the climate, for that carbon dioxide to be taken up, so that you achieve equilibrium of carbon dioxide. Now, suppose you were to fertilize in a place where you have up-down welling, where water mass goes down. So if you fertilize over here, and that you get to build up a deficit of CO2 here, and that water goes down before it's mixed with the atmosphere, then that's lost. You haven't gained anything. You're taking the deficit down with you. But in the Southern Ocean, this downwelling only happens in the north, in the outer rim of the Southern Ocean. So there you don't want to fertilize. And it takes a couple of months for this compensation to happen. And the Southern Ocean is very stormy. There's a lot of mixing going on. And every time you have mixing, You have a strong wind, and you have these waves, and then they smash, and you have all this water flying around and so on. And that's where the carbon dioxide is being taken up again from the air, right? And that's where the oxygen would be released at the same time, because it's happening at the same time. But the amount of oxygen that is entering the air from the ocean is very small, right? And in the past, of course, most of the oxygen that we have in the air came out of the ocean, but this took place like billion years, 2 billion years it took to oxygenate the atmosphere, right? So that oxygen story that every second breath comes from the ocean is, I'm sorry, it's just bullshit. And it gives the feeling that, oh, the oceans have to be protected, otherwise we will suffocate. And that's not true at all. It's just used as a scare story. Okay, so you understood where the problem is. No, the problem is that they are conflating, mixing up the concepts of primary production, carbon fixation. That carbon you can, of course, remove and fix somewhere else, right? And the oxygen stays in the water. Put it the other way around. If the oceans were actually giving off every second breath of oxygen we breathe, there would be huge amounts of carbon sequestered in the ocean to compensate that oxygen. Okay?
Yeah, I think the primary concern is that people only understand or only ever hear about photosynthesis in eutrophic areas around rivers and the river mouth. So typically that's, and as you mentioned, there's probably no carbon sequestration there. All these issues are negatively impacting the reputation of ocean iron fertilization, because it as everything in science, it depends, right? It depends what species is growing, what location are you selecting. And so maybe to give some numbers, so if we were to convert we started out with this emissions of like nitrous oxide and methane. And as you mentioned, there are some algae that if they decompose, they create these gases. Nitrous oxide, that's 98 times worse as a sort of global warming potential, and methane is like 25 times worse over these 100 years. So people believe, oh, if by accident you select the wrong location, so if by accident you grow the wrong kind of algae that decompose, suddenly you would make everything much worse. Suddenly you, instead of removing carbon, or if we calculate an CO2e adjusted, suddenly you might do damage to the climate because you produce these gases. And I guess the answer is it won't happen if you select the right area of the Southern Ocean. And it all depends on what algae is growing. So I guess it all depends of you need to monitor the ocean, you need to take water samples, you need to look under the microscope what is actually growing here, and you need to do this in multiple points. So if we, for example, were to work with the tourism industry in the Southern Ocean, and they would allow us to take water samples on each of their cruises, we could build up great data for very low cost. If there's always one scientist on board that samples the water, we could understand what is actually growing there. And if we were to fertilize that part of the ocean with iron, we could safely assume that only the algae that sink and only the algae that contribute positively to the ocean food web grows. So if we go back then to the model, we'd have a high probability of a carbon export and high probability of growing the ocean food web positively.
In the long term, you are not creating a problem, you are overcoming the problem, because you're building up the species populations in the water. So that is not an issue. And then, as I said already, the krill is in the Atlantic, and that's where all this feeding would be going on. Whereas if you move into the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, there's very much less krill there. And there you would need to not worry about the krill feeding on the algae, right? Because most of that stuff would then actually sink out to the seafloor. And then and that is then settled. It's not going to affect the oxygen concentrations. Like these resting spores I told you about, they're not broken down, so they're not consuming oxygen to start with. They're buried, they're gone. And that oxygen does get back into the atmosphere for us to breathe. But we don't need it really, because there's more than enough oxygen in the atmosphere. This concept of being very careful about where you fertilize, this depends on the krill, basically, where the krill is. And otherwise, the band around the continent is the same. It's the same type of water because it's going round and round. It's not standing there. standing still, like in other parts of the ocean, but circulating. This is by far the biggest current on the planet, the Antarctic circumpolar current. And I don't see any reason to give concern about that. It's only from the species basis. Yeah. The issue here is nutrients, where you have nutrients. We need nutrients. So wherever there are nutrients in the surface, that's where you would go. And that's also where the diatoms are, because the diatoms are evolved to grow under high concentrations, and they build up these blooms. So it's not surprising that you have the diatoms, but also this Phaeocystis, which you have here in pale blue. But the Phaeocystis is not a big sinker. But again, that depends on the zooplankton. What we found out during lower effects is that if you have enough zooplankton, they feed on the Phaeocystis preferentially before they make these colonies. These are little things that I can explain them all, but I don't want to tax your patience. But we
No,
understand.
we have all the time in the world. Like the point of the podcast is that we can talk about all the different aspects, and we can, if we want to, we can talk 1 hour about each topic, because the way I understand the current science is that there's a lot of confusion. So
Yes, that's confusion.
even if you've published on ocean iron fertilization multiple times, people are still confused. So there's many like experts that are just an expert on one specific topic, but there isn't really someone who took the time to talk about each of the misconceptions and the misunderstandings about ocean iron fertilization. It's in some sense one of the most misunderstood technologies in climate that I have come across. Like, it's so misunderstood. So we have all the time in the world. We can talk about each topic for as long as we like.
Yeah. All right. The phytoplankton. I explained to you in the beginning that I grew up with my eyes on the microscope, looking at the phytoplankton all along. And then I also counted everything that I saw. I did not restrict myself to any group, saying I'm the specialist of diatoms and I will not look at the others, or I'm this or I'm that or something. I was a plankton specialist, and I was going to get the entire plankton and all the plankton and all the pieces of the plankton also. So I also counted broken cells and grazing. I looked at fecal pellets, feces of the zooplankton, what was inside them, and so on and so forth. I have this holistic view. And I spent more than 2 years now in the Southern Ocean with my eyes on the microscope. I'm looking at the water, right? So I know I have a very good overview of what's going on in the Southern Ocean. And I really, honestly, to tell you the truth, I don't know anybody who has that overview of the phytoplankton and also of the biogeochemistry of the carbon cycle. I have to be immodest here, but I have to say I'm the only one, I think, that I know of. I have 1 or 2 of my students, but Christine Class, definitely. But otherwise, this is not common. So a lot of people who go around talking about the plankton of the Southern Ocean, they have never seen it. They have never looked through a microscope. They don't know what plankton looks like. And this is most of the people who are involved in ocean iron fertilization are biogeochemists, and it's below their dignity to look in a microscope. I'm sorry, whoever's listening to this now and feels insulted, then prove that you know plankton.
Yeah, I guess to summarize, the confusion is people believe you put a ton of iron in the ocean, and then they don't really track what kind of plant is growing. So they assume the worst kind of plant they know, and then they extrapolate all the issues on this worst kind. But for us, in order to explain ocean iron fertilization better, I think we need to track and need to show what phytoplankton is actually growing.
Yeah.
What is happening to this phytoplankton? Is it sinking? Is it not sinking? Is it a carbon sinker? Does it have the spores? Does it have a silica cell wall? Is it a diatom? Is it not a diatom? What kind of diatom it is? And we need to be more precise, because each phytoplankton is different. They are not created equal. And right now, the reputation around algae blooms is, in the layman's terms, they're all equally bad. All algae, because people don't understand there's so many, I think, million of different types of microalgae. For them, it's all the same. And then that's the common misconception. And just to get some clarity on this topic, according to our research and the experiments that we have done, it's the best way to control what algae is growing is to understand what algae is growing already. So you really have to take a water sample, you have to look under the microscope, and you have to analyze what is growing already. And then if you add nutrients, then likely the algae that have been growing already in whatever water body you are treating is going to grow more. And sometimes there's a population growth. So whatever algae is already there and it's already dominating maybe 40 or 50 or 60% of the community, maybe that grows to 70 or 80%. But typically the already dominant phytoplankton grow more. And there's rarely a case of community change, whether like an algae starts growing more or becomes dominant. Or maybe you could dive into your experience in algae communities. The key to understanding it is to understand what's there. The key must be the analytics and maybe to use, so we really have a good understanding of what happens in the digital world. In the digital world, we can track each pixel, we can really understand what's happening. And then even on land, we understand what plant is growing. We can look at the forest and we know what is this tree, what is this flower. You can analyze it within seconds. Today with AI, it's like super quick, but then to understand what's happening in the ocean, we need to take a water sample, we need to put it under the microscope, and then and that makes a huge difference to really know what's happening already.
Yeah, okay, so let me first talk about the species that are of relevance here. And then we move to how to assess them and understand them. All right. So when I say that there's a big range of species in the ocean or in the plankton, the fact is that you have different strategies, but the number of species is not big at all. And in the plankton, I would think that there are only about 1,000 species in the plankton in general, right? So the species that we grew during Eisenex, Chaetoceros Corvizatus, that was the first diatom I saw when I arrived in Kiel in 1964. There was a bloom of that in the Kiel bight, and I went out and took some samples and looked at it. And it was the same species, Chaetoceros corvizatus. There's this one. And Nietzsche, the one next to it, Pseudo-Nietzsche, that is also a very big genus and has very many species, these needles, not cells where the tips of the cells stick to each other and make needles. The phytoplankton has fewer species, and there's much more of algal species growing on the benthos, meaning attached to the seafloor. And that's because they are then segregated. Okay, now we're getting into evolutionary theory. I could also explain to you why that is. But the point is that the ocean waters are always mixing, right? They take a couple of 1,000, 2,000 years, and then the water which is today in Antarctic will land up in the Bering Strait. Not exactly that water. It's being mixed all the time, right? So
one of the biggest concern about ocean iron fertilization is, again, that you lose control. The concern is always you put in nutrients and then suddenly there's growth of harmful algal blooms. And as we discussed already, what's really important is to sample the ocean and to get an understanding of which phytoplankton are dominant already. Are those phytoplankton that have sinking potential? Are those phytoplankton that have feeding potential for krill and other animals of the food web? And are those phytoplankton that may decompose and create like low oxygen zones? That might there be phytoplankton that create toxins? And I think this is probably the biggest misconception about any kind of fertilization, and especially iron fertilization, because it's efficient. And the interesting thing is iron fertilization only works in iron limited areas of the ocean, and there's a lot of fertilization
the open ocean, you could say,
yeah,
the open ocean.
Yeah, and there's a lot of fertilization of the ocean through rivers, and then there's harmful algal blooms, and I think this example is this red tide example, and then there's this domoic acid problem with part of Pseudo-Nietzsche. So in some sense, the Southern Ocean doesn't have many of these problems, and maybe you could dive into why most toxic algae can't grow into the Southern Ocean, and then maybe also a little bit into the probability of Pseudo-Nietzsche producing domoic acid. And then furthermore, even if there's a domoic acid production, historically, what's the harm rate to let's say penguin and whales and or humans, and if we map this out in probabilities, in what probability zone are we moving here? Is it like a 1 to 1 million chance? Is it a 1 to 1 billion chance? And again, it all depends on the species, right? It all depends on which specific phytoplankton is growing in which specific area, and you can't mix it all together. That's what I learned so far.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I'll address the psychology behind all of this, right? And the psychology has to do with how we grew up and how we evolved, Homo sapiens. Now, we have predators that have been preying on us in the past, leopards and tigers and lions, depending on where we were. We always had this fear, and that fear was rewarded with survival, because whoever did not have that fear was eaten, right? That fear was an insurance against being eaten. That fear is still there, but there are no more predators. People now apply that fear to other things. They make kind of predators, artificial predators, like scare stories. Fear mongering, I call that. Because the potential for fear is there, but it just has to be incited by something. But if you remember, if you imagine what it was like under natural conditions, then I would say that very few humans actually reached the age that I have reached, because they were eaten before that by some tiger or lion or leopard particularly. Now, I grew up in a place where there were these leopards. There were always leopards around. And I had that fear because it was true. There were leopards, so I could have been eaten. I was not eaten. That's because we taught the leopards not to attack humans long ago. So I didn't have that. But I appreciate this fear. But since I know where that fear comes from, I don't have that fear now, and don't misplace that fear onto other things, like on phytoplankton. We here in the north, in industrialized countries, we think food is the most important because we've been obsessed with food in the past centuries. There were famines and food security was a problem. But now it's no longer a problem. Now we've become obese, because we get too much food. So food is not the problem. It's the predation which is the problem in the past that led to our evolution. And again, I'll just mention this again, that the fear that we have is a necessity for us to survive, but it's being misplaced now.
Humans are fundamentally mimetic, so humans don't compute themselves. I think this is a great point that those AI models are showing. So right now, these large language models, they are basically repeating what humans wrote down before. And I think what it reveals is that humans rarely think for themselves. Humans rarely compute themselves. So they rarely look at the data and form their own conclusions. What humans do is they have a headline, they have an article, they have a scare story that is an opinion oftentimes, a misinformed opinion based on primary data by a scientific experiment. And then those humans work exactly like those LLMs. They basically read those headlines, they synthesize those words, and they never challenge those words. And I think 99% of the people on Earth are not scientists, and they don't create their own experiments and form their own conclusions and are trying to falsify or validate some hypothesis. They're just completely mimetic. They just repeat in their minds what they've been told, what they're reading, but they don't challenge any of these words. And I think ocean iron fertilization is a fantastic example of this human weakness, that we do not think for ourselves and that we just read a headline, we believe it's bad, and then we skip forward to it. There is hope, though. There's a very interesting documentary on YouTube about this controversial Canadian experiment. And if you are reading the comments on YouTube, maybe around half or even more of the people, and the documentary is extremely biased. So the documentary is what you would call like a media hit job. So some editor said, okay, we need to show this in a very negative light, and we cut this in a way that it's scary, and we cut it. We try to form a narrative. We have a preformed narrative already, which we want to tell to our viewers because this creates good clicks. This is the kind of publicity that makes us money. But then, so it's extremely negative, it's extremely biased. But the YouTube comments under this documentary They are actually mostly positive. There's some negatives too, but people look through it and people are hopeful. Although this is supposed to be the most negative story possible, there's only really one documentary about OIF. There's only one sort of good visual, easy to consume YouTube video. And it's supposed to basically scare people away from OIF. But then the comments of and that's for me, I conclude that it's possible to convince people. It's possible if we hopefully create more experiments and hopefully create nice visuals. And once you have these, you just said earlier that maybe within hours you could see the whales, you could see the fish, the phytoplankton, they can grow. I think they quadruple per day within 24 hours, the cells like 4 times. Or they could on the highest point, or maybe 3 times. But if it's such a positive visual spectacle, and we show this visual spectacle to people, to a broad audience, and bring it on social media and make it viral, I believe many people will get hope. Many people that have climate anxiety, and many people that have anxiety that the whales are dying and that the ocean food web is damaged and that there's not enough food for animals in the ocean. And it seems to be possible, and humanity in history has shown that if a technology works, even if there's scaremongering around the technology, eventually that technology will succeed. Eventually, the benefits become so clear that you can't just suppress it forever.